Please be seated. The state having rested, is the defendant ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may call your first witness.
Defense calls Bonnie Parker.
Raise your right hand, ma'am. You solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Have a seat on the witness stand, please.
May I?
May proceed.
Now, Ms. Parker, could you please introduce yourself to the court?
My name is Bonnie Elizabeth Parker.
Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, ma'am. I'm the defendant in this case for my associations with Clyde Barrow.
And now, we've heard a lot of talk about Clyde Barrow today. How do you know him?
He and I met through a mutual friend, my friend Margaret. We've known each other for quite some time, and we were very good friends.
And we also earlier heard from Henry Methvin. Do you know him?
I do.
And how do you know him?
He was on the road with us for a while. He's a friend of Clyde's.
And would you say that you knew him for long enough to form an opinion about him?
Yes, I did, ma'am.
And did you form an opinion about his character for truthfulness?
Yes, ma'am.
And what was that opinion?
I think that Henry's a liar, ma'am.
Now, I'm going to take you to April 1st. Do you remember that day?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
And where were you?
Well, we were on our way to Grapevine to visit my family for Easter.
And was anyone with you?
Yes, ma'am. It was me and Clyde and Henry.
And where exactly were you at this time?
Well, we were on the road in a car on Dove Road.
And on Dove Road, were you near the intersection of Highway 114 and Dove?
Yes, ma'am. We were just north of Highway 114.
What time did you arrive?
Oh, it was early in the morning. We were supposed to meet my family later on.
And while you were waiting to meet your family, did you do anything?
Yes, ma'am. Henry had some whiskey, and he passed it around between the two of us.
And did you do anything else?
Yes, ma'am. After we had a couple drinks, I took a nap in the back seat.
Now, you said also that Clyde was there, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, did Clyde stay awake the entire time?
No, ma'am. He fell asleep in the front seat. Henry was the only one who was still awake. He was still drinking when I went to sleep.
Did you smoke that day?
No, ma'am.
I'm going to take you a little bit later on in that day. At what time did you wake up?
Well, I don't know exactly what time it was, ma'am, but I woke up hearing gunshots and Clyde yelling at Henry.
What was Clyde yelling?
Objection. Hearsay.
It is sustained.
Now, after you saw Clyde and Henry outside, what happened next?
Well, I'm sorry. I heard the two of them screaming, and I saw two lawmen laying on the ground. One of them wasn't moving. He looked like he was dead. But the other one was still alive. And I thought maybe I could help and see if he was still alive, if I could help him. And then I saw Henry take out a gun from his waistband and shoot that poor officer 2 more times.
Now, I'm sorry to have to ask you about this. I know that it's really difficult. But did you ever get out of the car?
Yes, ma'am.
And what did you do when you got out of the car?
Well, I was just so upset. I was screaming and running toward him and crying and shaking. I just wanted to help him.
And were you able to help him?
No, ma'am.
And why weren't you able to help him?
Because he was already dead.
Now, I want to take you just a little bit after that. Once you found out that the officers were dead, what happened after that?
Well, Clyde and me and Henry all got back in the car. And we started driving back down the road. We were going on Highway 14 toward Grapevine, east.
When you say Highway 14, do you mean Highway 114?
Yes, ma'am.
And when you were driving on Highway 114, or when you turned around, did you see anybody else?
Yes, we saw another car, someone in it.
If you could put up the slide. Now handing you what's been labeled Defendant's Exhibit 2. There's a copy for you also. Now, this is a map of Highway 114 and Dove Road where it intersects. Now, assuming that you're the black car, that black rectangle at the top,
Yes, ma'am.
and that behind you, the 2 gray ovals are the police motorcycles,
Yes, ma'am.
and then the blue car is the person you passed while you were going back to Highway 114. Is this a fair and accurate depiction of the intersection of Highway 114 and Dove Road on April 1st?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Now move Defendant's Exhibit 2 into evidence.
No objection, again, as long as there's some marking on there before it's entered in that it's not to scale.
That's fine, Your Honor.
2 is received.
Now, to be clear, Ms. Parker, you were on the north side of the intersection, correct?
That's correct.
And you were on the east side of the street, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And once again, that blue car is the car that you saw as you were leaving Dove Road and pulling onto Highway 114, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Were you offered a plea bargain in this case?
I was.
And did you take that plea bargain?
No, ma'am, I did not.
And what was that plea bargain for?
They offered.
Objection? Your Honor, this plea bargain has not been discussed.
It is sustained.
Now, Ms. Parker, did you shoot Officer Murphy on
No.
April 1st?
No, I did not.
No further questions.
Cross-exam.
Thank you, Your Honor. Counselor, is this yours? Very important. May I proceed, Your Honor?
Proceed.
Good evening, Ms. Parker. I just have a few questions for you. I understand it seems you're a bit upset. If you need me to repeat a question or slow down or something, please let me know.
Thank you, sir.
Of course. Ms. Parker, I don't usually ask this, but how old are you?
Well, a girl never likes to reveal her age, sir.
Certainly, but you are under oath.
Well, I was.
Let's put it this way, if I can rephrase, since it appears that this question in particular is a little on the baffling side. About how old would you have been on April 1st of 1934 if you were born round about September of 1910?
I would have been about 24. I was best in spelling and public speaking
Thank you
and
very
writing.
much. Miss Parker. Not arithmetic, though, is that right?
Right, sir.
Right, of course. Now, about how tall are you, or, I'm sorry, how tall were you on April 1st of 1934?
I was about 5'3" tall.
All right. And you were part of the Barrow Gang on that date, is that right?
Pardon?
You were part of the Barrow Gang on that date?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, you've mentioned in the past that you wanted to seem like you fit in with the Barrow Gang, is that right?
That's correct.
And you might have made some statements to journalists that your gang had kidnapped to that end, right?
Yes, Your Honor. Some proper character evidence.
And that'll be overruled.
Miss Parker, to clarify my question, you had previously stated to a reporter, and these reports later made it out to newspapers, of which you are well aware. Rather, I'll clarify this question. You're aware that the Barrow Gang received some pretty heavy press coverage, right?
That's right.
Because the gang kidnapped journalists.
We took some people with us once in a while, yes.
And occasionally there were reporters.
Sometimes.
And in fact, you think that they had the time of their lives while they were with you all, to be later let go.
I think none of them seemed to really mind it that much,
You think they thought it was exciting as you did?
perhaps.
And in fact, there are certain statements that you'd make to them just to try to fit in with the gang, as you've said in the past. Statements like, damn the law,
That's right.
and statements like, the law is trying to keep us down,
Yes, sir.
and maybe even, we got to get those lawmen.
Yes, I think I said that.
So those are all statements that you've made in the past, correct?
Yes, sir.
And some other things you might have done to try to fit in, to use your words, might be to chew on cigars. Is that right?
Well, I took a picture with one once, but I've never smoked one.
Correct. Thank you. My question was slightly different. My question was just, did you chew on cigars just for the look?
In a picture once.
Okay, so you've had a cigar in your mouth before. You know, a stranger to the art of cigar chewing, perhaps.
Well, I mean, I put it in my mouth.
Thank you very much. If we could display. This has already been entered as State's Exhibit 1. Do you recognize what's in the picture here?
Yes, sir.
Something you might have chewed on in the past?
Perhaps.
Now, is it just me, or does one of the ends look slightly chewed upon with small teeth marks?
It does.
Thank you very much. Now, to that end, neither were you any stranger to whiskey. Is that right?
No, sir.
Okay. So you've drank before. We're all adults here.
Yes, sir. Apparently, I'm legal.
No response. Now, whenever you would drink, let's say whiskey, was that your drink of choice, just out of curiosity?
Yes, I enjoy whiskey.
Okay. But now, your mother doesn't really like when you drink whiskey, is that right?
No, sir.
I understand. Mine certainly doesn't. She's in the audience tonight. Mother, I never drink, I swear. Now, whenever you do drink whiskey, sometimes you'll chew lemons, right, to cover up the smell?
Lemon peels, yes.
Lemon peels, right, or maybe lemon slices?
The peel in particular.
The peel in particular. If we could advance to the next slide. Now, this has already been entered as State's Exhibit 2, or State's Exhibit 3, pardon me. Do these look like lemons of the variety which you might chew upon having drank whiskey to cover up the smell?
Well, I suppose so.
And would it surprise you to learn that lemon peels very similar to this, actually these exact lemon peels, were recovered at the scene of the incident on April 1st of 1934?
They look awfully fresh.
We'll assume that photo technology is very advanced and that they would have taken this picture very soon after the events of April 1st, 1934. Now, would it also surprise, thank you very much, Bailiff, would it surprise you to learn that a cigar, in fact, the cigar that we showed earlier, was also found on the scene of the incident on April 1st of 1934?
Suppose not.
All right, so You've said that it wouldn't surprise you to know that those cigars and those lemons were found on the scene. There were some other things found on the scene, and I'd sort of like to discuss those with you. You recall the events of April 1st of 1934?
I do.
Now, as part of the gang, you've already said that you would chew cigars to fit in.
I put one in my mouth once, yes.
Right. And we made certain, that you made certain statements to journalists, again, just to fit in, of course.
Yes, sir.
And that you'd chew lemons of the kind that we just showed on the screen to cover up the smell of whiskey, which you would also drink when you were with the Barrow Gang, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, as I understand it, you're also a pretty good shot. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you've used different kinds of firearms before?
I have.
Okay. And when I say different kinds, I mean you've used a shotgun.
Yes, sir.
And maybe even a Browning automatic rifle, a BAR, if you will.
Yes, sir.
Maybe a handgun.
I don't recall.
Maybe a .45 handgun.
I don't recall, sir.
Now, your memory seems so fresh on having used the other handguns. I just want to be clear. You're saying that you can't remember if you've ever used a pistol,
That's right.
but you can remember using the other two sorts of weapons, certainly.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. If we could advance a slide. Ms. Parker, do you recognize what I'm showing here? This is State's Exhibit 4. Can you tell me what you see here?
Well, sir, I believe I've seen my daddy with these when he goes hunting.
Mm-hmm.
They seem to be shells?
Yes, they certainly are. Those are shotgun shells. You know that.
Yes, sir.
Right. Shotgun shells, and you would know that because you've used a shotgun before.
Yes, sir.
Right. If we could advance 2 slides. Now, what I'm showing you now is actually another slide. This is a shell from a Browning automatic rifle casing, is it not?
I believe so.
Okay. Again, and you would know that because you have used such a weapon before.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And if we could advance just 1 slide. And 1 slide 1. Now, I'm now showing you what's we've already talked about as State's... No, we haven't. We haven't talked about it yet. But it is State's Exhibit 6. It's mislabeled on the slide. I apologize. You recognize these as .45 caliber shell casings?
They could be.
They could be. Thank you. If we could advance 1 slide. Now, you recognize these because you've seen them before.
Yes, sir.
Because people in your gang have used them before.
They have.
And because you've used them before.
I've used some, yes.
Yes, you fired these weapons before.
Some, yes.
And you're a pretty good shot.
Yes, sir.
You ever shot at someone?
No, sir.
You've never shot at a police officer?
I've been very careful not to shoot at anyone, sir.
Thank you very much, Ms. Parker. But my question was, have you ever shot at someone, as in the direction of someone?
Yes, sir.
So you have shot towards someone, perhaps without hitting them?
Absolutely, without hitting them, sir.
But you've actually hit close enough to a police officer that he was injured by the shards of wood that flew back in his face.
Objection, Your Honor. This is improper character evidence.
Well, it's not improper character evidence, but the objection will be sustained. I'd like to see counsel over at the sidebar for a moment.
Ms. Parker, I appreciate your patience. I ain't got too many questions left yet, as Henry Methvin might say. Then again, he might say a lot of things. So, you have shot at someone, including a police officer.
Yes, sir.
Do you recall an incident on April 33? There was a raid on the Joplin farm belonging to Clyde Barrow's brother,
Yes, sir.
and you were there?
I was.
You were present at the raid?
Yes, sir.
And there were police who had surrounded the farm?
Yes, sir.
And in fact, people in the Barrow gang were shooting at the police officers.
Yes, sir.
Now, you recall laying down covering fire for the other people on the farm. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So, let me get this straight. Are you aware that 2 police officers were killed during the Barrow Gang's escape at the Joplin raid?
Yes, sir.
Just to be clear, while there are others who were shooting and killing officers of the law, you did not run weeping to help them. Instead, you were helping the shooters by laying down covering fire. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
I'd like to talk to you about the events of April 1st of 1934 briefly, if I could. You had opportunities to leave the Barrow Gang, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
But you never did.
No, sir.
Now, you thought about leaving the gang on April 1st of 1934,
I did.
visiting your family.
Yes.
But you did not leave the Barrow Gang on that date.
I didn't get that far.
In fact, back in January of 1933, whenever you claim, in January of 1933, you claimed that Clyde Barrow fired a shot that fatally injured a deputy.
Yes, sir.
And in April of 1933, just 4 months later, you were present at the Joplin raid, providing covering fire while others shot at officers of the law, correct?
Yes, sir.
And in July of 1933, just 4 months after that, you were involved in separate shootouts in both Kansas City and Iowa.
Yes, sir.
And later that year, in 1933, you were actually shot in the legs in another firefight. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And then finally, in January of 1934, just 4 months before the murder of Officer W.D. Murphy, you are aware that the Barrow Gang undertook the Eastham incident, right? The raid on Eastham Jail?
Yes.
After none of these incidents, did you decide to leave the gang?
No, sir.
And it was perhaps during or while these events were going on that you made those statements like, damn the law, and we got to get those lawmen.
Yes, sir.
It was during these events that you were trying to fit in with the gang.
Yes, sir.
The gang that was killing police and robbing banks and stores.
Yes, sir.
You liked being part of the Barrow Gang?
For a while.
In fact, you wrote some poems to that end, isn't that right? One of them called The Trail's End.
Yes, sir.
Your Honor, the parties have stipulated to the admission of what I'll introduce now as State's Exhibit 7. It's the poem entitled Trail's End, written by Ms. Parker. Any objections?
No objection, Your Honor.
7 is received.
Permission to demonstrate or publish excerpts of it for the jury. Thank you very much. If we could go forward a few slides yet. There's one. Ms. Parker, could you read aloud this particular passage? I believe this is from your poem. Do you recognize it?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so this is your writing?
Yes. Again, spelling was my strong suit.
Okay, thank you very much. Could you read this briefly?
There's lots of untruths to these write-ups. They're not as ruthless as that. Their nature is raw. They hate all the law, the stool pigeon spotters and rats.
Thank you very much. If we could leave that up there for just a second. You're aware that this was the idea, this was sort of the mantra of the Barrow Gang. They didn't like lawmen.
No, sir.
They didn't like snitches.
No, sir.
And they didn't like witnesses.
No, sir.
Now, on April 34th, thank you very much, if we could advance one slide. On April 34th of 1934, you did exit the car, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, let's go back. You had been drinking.
Yes, sir.
Were you surprised to hear that the cigar, the whiskey, and the lemon peels were all found at the scene of the murder?
No, sir.
So you heard shots.
Yes, sir.
You exited the car.
Yes.
And then you shot Trooper W.D. Murphy.
No, sir.
No, in fact, that's right. You say that Henry Methvin shot the officer. Isn't that why you think Henry's a liar?
That's not why I think he's a liar, but I know that he shot him.
Thank you. In fact, and I wrote this down because I thought this was interesting what you said on direct. You said that you saw Henry shoot 2 more times with a .45. He shot Officer Murphy twice with the .45. Is that your testimony?
I said that he shot him with a handgun, yes.
You actually said that he shot him 2 more times.
Yes, sir.
So would it surprise you to hear that there were actually 5 .45 caliber shells found at the scene of the accident?
It wouldn't surprise me, but I remember him pulling the trigger twice.
Thank you. No further questions.
Redirect.
Briefly, Your Honor. Ms. Parker, did you have a cigar in your mouth on April 1st, 1934?
No, ma'am.
And have you ever shot anybody?
No, ma'am.
Did you use a weapon on April 1st, 1934?
No.
Now, I want to go back to something that the prosecution just asked you. They were talking about the shell casings from the 45. You only saw Henry Methvin. How many shots did you see him shoot?
2.
Did you hear anything before you saw him shoot those?
Yes, ma'am, that's what woke me up.
Now, did you shoot Officer Murphy?
No, ma'am.
No further questions.
You may step down, ma'am.
Thank you.
Defense, call your next witness.
Your Honor, the defense would like to play the video recording from Clyde Barrow.
Good afternoon, Mr. Barrow. Could you state your name for the record, please? Good afternoon, Mr. Barrow. Could you state your name for the record, please?
Yes, my name is Clyde Barrow.
And tell us a little bit about yourself.
What do you want to know?
Well, where are you from, Mr. Barrow?
I'm originally from rural Texas. I grew up on my dad's farm, but when I was still pretty young, the bank stole it from us. We had to relocate to West Dallas. We lived in like slums and shanties. You know, my 6 brothers and sisters and I lived under a wagon for almost a year because my parents, couldn't afford to make any real money. That gives you kind of an idea of, the reality we were facing.
Sure. Now, when did you first meet a Miss Bonnie?
I met Bonnie 1930, somewhere around the springtime in 1930.
And when would you say that you and Miss Bonnie started traveling?
1932.
Could you tell us where you did your traveling?
Mainly the Midwest, Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa. Sometimes we would go as far north as Minnesota. Generally tried to avoid Kansas. I just found like the people from there kind of gave off this odor. Have you ever smelled a Kansan?
You know, I haven't.
You're better off, all right.
All right. Well, let's see here. Now, how tall are you, Mr. Barrow?
5'7", I think. Why does that matter?
Well, now don't you worry about that. You just let me ask my questions.
Go ahead.
Why are you giving this deposition today?
I'm giving this deposition today because the story that Henry Methvin has created is absolute crap. He's trying to save his own skin because he was put on death row. And so he's just making up any sort of story and just repeating it until it sticks. Bonnie's not a murderer. She's not a violent person. She would never hurt anybody.
Okay, well, all right, let's switch gears a little bit. What kind of weapons did you carry when you were on the road?
We carried a lot of different weapons. It kind of depended on the day. You got another question?
Yes, I do. Now just hold your horses. I'll get through them. All right, let's take you back a little bit. April 1st, 1934. What happened?
Well, on April 1st, 1934, we were parked on the shoulder of Dove Road, which intersected with Highway 114 outside Grapevine, Missouri. We were there because we were going to meet up with Bonnie's family for Easter Sunday. Bonnie and I were asleep in the car, and Henry woke me up and said, we got some trouble, boss. What are we going to do about this? Points the rearview mirror. I look in the mirror. I see 2 highway patrolmen approaching the car. I tell Henry, let's take them. He must have misunderstood what I said because he got out of the car carrying a 16-gauge shotgun, immediately shot the officer that was the closest to the car, and then went and shot the other officer. At this time, I got out of the car. I grabbed a rifle, and I shot the rifle in the air and yelled at Henry to stop.
Okay, now, what happened to that one injured police officer? What happened to him?
Well, Henry and I approached him. It was pretty obvious that he wasn't going to survive, his gunshot wounds, and so I kind of nodded to Henry. Henry took the .45 from his waist pocket and shot the officer repeatedly until he was dead. Now, Bonnie, who, this had all happened pretty quickly, and Bonnie really hadn't seen what happened. She ran out to see if she could help the officers. She came out there to see if she could help them.
Oh my! Now, how long had you known this Medved?
4 months or something like that. I mean, yeah, not that long.
Well, earlier you said something. You said that something like Bonnie never hurt anybody. She'd never kill a person, ever.
Yeah, that's what I said. She wouldn't hurt a fly. She's just not a violent person.
And you thought that she loved you. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she, made a lot of sacrifices to be with me those couple of years. And I mean, if I was being honest about it, I could sense some distance or whatever growing between us those last couple of months. But, I loved her and I wasn't going to let her get away.
Now, wait a minute. What do you mean by that?
Exactly that. I wasn't going to let her get away.
Okay, now. Mr. Barrow, why do you hate the law so much?
You want to know the truth?
I sure do.
Well, from 1930 to 1932, I was in prison at the East End prison complex. I went into prison pretty soon after I met Bonnie. And during those 2 years that I was in there, I was repeatedly assaulted by another inmate. I mean, you got to remember that when I went in there, I was 20 years old, weighed like 150, 160 pounds, and this guy was an old timer. He weighed close to 250, knew everybody in there. And throughout these 2 years that I was assaulted, the police officers would just turn a blind eye and in several circumstances actually help this guy assault me. So when you go through that for 2 years and you get out, you got a little chip on your shoulder.
I see.
You have any more questions?
I do.
Could I say something to Bonnie?
All right, well,
real quick.
Make it fast, son.
Bonnie Parker, I love you with every fiber of my being. And, I never intended for this to happen. You don't deserve any of this. I wish we had led a different life, but it just wasn't meant to be. I'm sorry.
All right, that's enough, son. Thank you.
Defendant, call your next witness.
Your Honor, the defense calls Mrs. Margaret Geigel.
Would you raise your right hand, ma'am? Solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Have a seat.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mrs. Geigel.
Good evening.
Would you please introduce yourself to the jury?
My name is Margaret Geigel.
Could you tell us where you're from?
I am from Grapevine, Missouri,
And for how long have you been living here?
my entire life.
And can you tell us what you do with your time in Grapevine?
I am a respected senior citizen of Grapevine, and I was the mayor of Grapevine 3 years ago, and I am very involved in my church.
So you're the mayor. Is that a political position? Is that a volunteer position? You get paid for that?
It was volunteer.
And are you familiar with the intersection in Grapevine of Highway 114 and Dove Road?
I am.
All right. I'd like to turn your attention, if you would, to April 1st, 1934. What were you doing that day?
It was Easter morning, and I had just gone to church, and I was driving to go visit my friend, Buck.
And where is Buck?
He lives in New Dover.
So what road were you on, ma'am?
I was on 114 West.
And did you see anything unusual that afternoon while you were driving on 114 West?
Well, I was driving, and there were 3 police officers on motorcycles, and they drove past me, and I recognized one of them, and I waved, and he waved back.
And who was the man that you recognized?
It was Officer Murphy.
And how is it you knew the man?
Well, the gal he was engaged to was a very good friend of mine from the church.
And after you saw the 3 officers, where did they go?
Oh, they just drove, and then I didn't see them anymore.
And what happened next for you?
Well, I heard some noises, but I didn't know where they were coming from. I just kept driving, and then as I got closer, they sounded more like gunshots. And finally, I came to this intersection, and I stopped, and I saw where the noise was coming from.
You said you came to an intersection. Which intersection was that, ma'am?
It was Dove and 114.
And you at that time were driving on 114, is that what you said?
I was on 114.
And when you got to the intersection, did you see anything unusual?
I saw this big fancy black sedan there, and 2 motorcycles and 2 police officers on the ground.
And on what road were those vehicles, ma'am?
They were on Dove.
And were they to your right or to your left?
They were to my right.
So would that be to the north or to the south?
No, that would be to the north.
Thank you. And about how far away from you were these vehicles?
I would say about 200 yards.
So 200 yards to the north of the intersection, is that right?
Yes.
And when you saw the vehicles, did you see anything else?
Well, I saw 2 officers on the ground, and one of them was still kind of moving. And these 2 men came out, and one of them was bigger, and he turned the guy over, and he shot him, and shot him, and shot him.
All right, ma'am. I'd like to show you a map, and a copy for you, Your Honor, and for counsel. Ma'am, this is a map of the intersection of Dove Road and Highway 114. And you see that there's a marking in the center of the intersection. Is that about where your car was?
Yes.
And is the arrow starting at the right of the map and going toward that car, does that show where you came from before getting to the intersection?
That is correct.
And off to the right of that car, near the north, near the top of the map, where that black rectangle is that where the car you described was?
Yes, it is.
And where those 2 ovals are between you and the car, is that where the 2 motorcycles you saw were, ma'am?
Yes, sir, it is.
And what happened after the shooting?
Well, after the man stopped moving, the 2 men got back in the car, and they started to come toward me, and they drove past me, and they looked me right in the eye. I thought they were going to shoot me, but I just froze, and I didn't know what to do. And they drove past, and then I noticed there was this woman in the back seat, and I couldn't tell if she was laughing or crying or what, but she had some white rabbit or something in her hands.
And what direction did they head off?
They were going the opposite direction of me, so east.
Is that black arrow on the map a correct depiction of where they went in their black car after the shooting?
Yes.
So on the whole, is the entirety of this map a fair and accurate depiction of where things were and what you saw that afternoon?
Very much so.
Thank you. The defense moves the admission of this map as Exhibit 3 for the defense. No objection.
3 is received.
Ma'am, I see you're wearing a set of glasses. Are those the same? Well, excuse me. Were you wearing those glasses on April 1st?
Yes, I was.
Looking through those glasses after the shooting, did you take a moment to look at the men who had been shot?
Oh, yeah.
Did you recognize either of them?
Oh, yeah.
Whom did you recognize, ma'am?
I recognized the one. He was from that gang. No?
The man who had been shot.
Oh, the man who had been shot. That was the officer.
And
Officer Murphy.
And was Officer Murphy the one who was dead when you arrived, or the one who was moving a little bit and then was murdered in front of your very eyes?
I believe he was the one that was moving.
And you were able to tell from your car who that man was at that distance?
I could.
And when you saw that, how did you feel?
I felt terrible for his girlfriend.
And what did you yourself do at that time?
I felt very sad.
And where did you go then?
Well, I continued on to my friend Buck's house.
And what happened when you got there?
Well, I decided to call the police.
And when the police came in response to the call, did you speak to them?
I did. I told them everything I've told you here today.
Ma'am, before April 1st, 1934, had you ever met Bonnie Parker?
Oh, no.
Had you ever met Clyde Barrow?
Oh, no.
Had you ever met Henry Methvin?
No.
Why are you here today testifying on behalf of a woman who's a member of a notorious criminal gang?
I am just here to tell the truth.
No further questions, ma'am.
Cross-exam.
Ms. Geigel, did you just tell this jury that you were a couple of hundred yards away when you saw everything?
Yes.
And what emotions were you experiencing at the time that you saw the men with the guns?
I was very surprised.
Were you just surprised?
I was scared.
Were you frozen with fear?
I suppose you could say that.
Ms. Geigel, did you ever see a third figure outside of the car?
Not outside of the car.
You only ever saw two people outside the car?
I only saw two people.
When was the last time you had your eyes examined, ma'am?
I had them checked shortly after the thing.
When was the last time you had them examined prior to the incident?
It had been a year.
No further questions.
Any further questions for the witness?
Just real quick. You saw two people outside of that car, is that right, ma'am?
That is correct.
One was taller than the other?
One was.
Which man shot Officer Murphy?
The taller one.
You have any doubt that it was a man who shot that man?
I really don't.
Thank you.
You may step down.
Thank you.
Does the defendant have any further evidence?
No, Your Honor, the defense rests.
The defense having rested, is there any rebuttal evidence from the state?
There is none, Your Honor.
Very well. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that will conclude the evidence that you're going to hear in this case. I'm going to read to you an instruction on the law. It applies to all criminal cases, and then you will hear the closing arguments of counsel and retire to your jury room to select a foreperson and deliberate and arrive at your verdict. Find it. Isn't this packet count? It's burden of proof. Burden of proof? It's right there at the top. Oh, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the charge of any offense is not evidence, and it creates no inference that any offense was committed or that the defendant is guilty of an offense. The defendant is presumed to be innocent unless and until during your deliberations upon your verdict you find her guilty. This presumption of innocence places upon the state the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. A reasonable doubt is doubt based upon reason and common sense after careful and impartial consideration of all the evidence in the case. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is proof that leaves you firmly convinced of the defendant's guilt. The law does not require proof that overcomes every possible doubt. If after your consideration of all the evidence you are firmly convinced that the defendant is guilty of the crime charged, you will find her guilty. If you are not so convinced, you must give her the benefit of the doubt and find her not guilty. The attorneys will now have the opportunity of arguing their case to you. You will bear in mind that their arguments are not evidence. They're just there to help you recall the evidence that you heard in the trial. At the conclusion of the closing arguments of the counsel, then you'll retire into the custody of the sheriff, select your foreperson, and deliberate and arrive at your verdict. Is the state with 7 minutes left for closing argument, how would you like to divide your time?
Your Honor, we'd like to take 3 minutes for the statement of law and 4 minutes for our rebuttal.
Very well.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have sat through 6 witnesses. But what you have to consider when you go back into that jury room to make the determination of Bonnie Parker's guilt in the murder of H.D. Murphy is whether or not she committed this crime and killed a man, H.D. Murphy, by shooting in Grapevine, Missouri. The law will instruct you in these instructions that you go through each of the elements and find each element beyond a reasonable doubt. First, that Bonnie Parker killed H.D. Murphy by shooting him. The second element, that she knew her conduct would cause his death. And the third element, that the defendant's purpose was to cause that death. Murder in the first degree requires act with deliberation. That means that she knew what she was doing when she did it. In a moment, I'll get up and talk to you a bit about the facts, but you need to keep your mind focused on the law when you go back and to deliberate in the jury room. If you go through each of the elements and you apply those to the facts that you've heard here today, you will find Ms. Bonnie Parker guilty of first-degree murder.
Counsel for the defendant may proceed with closing argument.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, at the beginning of this trial, my colleague said that Bonnie Parker was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and boy, was she right. I'd like to add one more wrong to this story. Got the wrong place at the wrong time. The prosecution has charged the wrong defendant. This trial is what country lawyers sometimes refer to as an old-fashioned swearing contest. Our witnesses come in and swear to tell the truth. Their witnesses come in and swear to tell the truth. And you have to listen to all the testimony and sift out the truth from the fiction. The unfortunate part about a swearing contest is that somebody's lying under oath, because there's just no way that all the sworn testimony you heard today could be the truth or anything close to it. There's just no way that Bonnie Parker and Henry Methvin, to pick two examples, can both be speaking the truth. Now, we're not putting on any funny defenses this evening. We're not talking about the heat of passion. We're not talking about duress. We're not saying Bonnie Parker killed that man, but she was crazy. We're not saying she'd had too much to drink and can't remember what happened. We're not saying she had a miserable childhood and you should feel bad for her. We're saying she didn't do it because it's the truth. She didn't do it. So let's talk about this swearing contest. Unfortunately for the government, unfortunately for us, star witnesses in this case both have tremendous motives to falsify their testimony. I'm not going to insult the intelligence of the jury and pretend that someone who's on trial for a capital crime has no motive to fabricate. And I hope that the prosecution won't insult your testimony by suggesting that a man like Henry Methvin, whose testimony is being given in exchange for leniency, has no motive to make the prosecution happy with his testimony, even if he didn't necessarily do an especially good job this evening. Fortunately for us, there are some backup singers, as it were, in this production. You don't have to believe Bonnie Parker or believe Henry Methvin to decide exactly what's right today. We had William Schaefer and Officer Polk Ivy for the government. For the defense, we had Clyde Barrow and Margaret Geigel, and I'll get back to what they had to say in a moment. But first, let's talk about what is completely undisputed, that all the witnesses agree on, or at least that as far as I know, the prosecution and we have no quarrels about. First of all, we know that when the morning dawned on April 1st, 1934, Clyde Barrow and Henry Methvin were wanted men in Texas for a prison break in which an officer was murdered and another was assaulted, indeed assaulted by Henry Methvin himself. That was in January of 1934. We know that a little while later, in February of 1934, that these same men, Clyde and Henry, broke into an armory in Texas and stole weapons and ammunition. We know that just a little bit later, also in February 1934, Clyde and Henry committed an armed bank robbery, also in Texas. And then on April 1st, 1934 itself, what do we know? We know that Bonnie, Henry, and perhaps Clyde as well were drinking whiskey, passing around the bottle that you've seen. We know that Bonnie had perhaps a little too much to drink, passed out in the Ford V8 along with Clyde. Henry, however, was outside the car and therefore was the first to understand that there was trouble for them, that two officers were approaching them on their motorcycles. As the officers made this fatal turn north on Dove Road off of Highway 114, we understand that Henry went to the car and quietly, so as not to disturb Bonnie Parker, woke up Clyde Barrow. That Clyde Barrow and Henry were then outside of the car as the officers approached, while Bonnie remained inside. And we know, based on Henry Methvin's own admission, that he pointed a weapon at the nearest officer, aimed at him, pulled the trigger, and he told you today that he believes he got the officer in the shoulder. We also know, according to his own testimony, that Henry Methvin's north of 6 feet tall, and we heard from Clyde Barrow that he's 5'7". All this is undisputed. No doubt as to any of it. So what's next? Next, we've got Henry's story, and we've got Bonnie's story. And I'll just review each of them, and you can decide which you think is more believable. Let's begin with Henry's. Henry reports that the whole incident, from first shot to last, took but a few seconds. But a few seconds from when Henry aimed his weapon at a lawman and pulled the trigger till when those final shots from the .45 caliber pistol finished off the last chance of Officer Murphy. Just a few seconds. He also reports that Bonnie Parker, who was asleep, again undisputed, asleep when the first shot rang out, somehow emerges from the Ford V8, smoking this cigar, produces a .45 caliber pistol, walks on over from the car to the wounded motorcycle cop, and kills Officer Murphy. Now, I don't know how familiar the ladies and gentlemen of the jury are with cigar smoking and cigar lighting, but at least in Grapevine, Missouri, it generally takes at least a few seconds just to get a cigar going, and while I've never tried to light one immediately upon waking up, I imagine it might take even longer for me to fumble around and locate my cigar cutter, and then remember where before I fell asleep I stashed the matches, get a match out, strike on box, oh, I dropped it, that takes another moment right there, retrieve it, get the cigar going, put some tiny teeth marks on it, exit my vehicle, and find a man to kill in cold blood. That's one story.
2 minutes, Counsel.
Sure thing, Your Honor. If that story's true, Bonnie Parker's guilty of murder. Or, of course, there's Bonnie's story that she was sleepy, barely awake when the shot rang out, managed to exit the vehicle just in time to see the final shots. Now, what do we know about Bonnie Parker? We know that the government has told you all sorts of interesting things about other things she might have done. But she's not on trial for anything that happened in Joplin or anywhere else besides Grapevine, Missouri. So let's compare our backup witnesses. If we could get the slide, please. Who do we have? We've got Polk Ivy for the government. Let's go to the last one. There we go. Oh, no. Polk Ivy, the lawman, who admits that he was not there when the crime occurred. So to his credit, he's not claiming to know who did it. And then we have William Schaefer. I need the last one. There we go. William Schaefer, who was in the copse of trees to the southwest of Highway 114. So however far away Miss Geigel was, Schaefer was at least 100 yards further because the vehicle was to the north of the intersection, and perhaps Miss Geigel's car was in the way. He saw what he saw, but he was even further than 100 yards away when the first shot rang out, and it took but a few seconds, and he used those few seconds apparently to go back to his home and get his gun, and then return to the copse of trees. I don't believe he was using his aeroplane for this travel, so took him at least some time. He gets to the copse of trees where he's a good few hundred yards away from the car with his glasses on, his Chicago spectacles, which he says do not give him superhuman sight. And he saw what he saw. I'm not calling the man a liar. I'm just saying he was a good distance away, blocked by a car. Then you hear from Clyde Barrow. I'm not even going to talk about that. He's a notorious gangster, not my best witness. However, we have the widow Geigel in her vehicle, looking out with her unobstructed, closer view, and she sees two men, one shorter, one taller. As it happens, Clyde is 5'7", and Henry's north of 6 feet. She sees the taller man pull the trigger, killing the officer. Bonnie Parker, of course, told you the same thing, that the taller of the two gangsters pulled the trigger. Ms. Geigel has absolutely no motive to lie. Is it possible that she neglected to see Bonnie Parker get out of the car and wail over the body of the officer in the brief moment she had before they got back in the car to drive away, fleeing east on Highway 114? It's possible. But why would Ms. Geigel come in and lie to you? Why would she think she saw a taller man pull the trigger if it didn't happen? She knew Officer Murphy and wants to see justice served. Fortunately, in a swearing contest, the defense doesn't actually have to win to win. If you retire to the jury room and you say, boy, Bonnie Parker and her people might be telling the truth, then again, maybe Henry Methvin's magic cigar story is accurate. Perhaps that cigar was obtained from the man who sold Jack his beanstalk beans, and that she really was that fast, and Mr. Schaefer is that fast himself. And you just say, I think the younger man had a good view. If that's what you think, you say, could be true, could be true. That equals a verdict of not guilty. The only way you can return a verdict of guilty is if Bonnie Parker committed this murder. If you believe beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Schaefer saw accurately and Ms. Geigel, who was closer, either didn't see or is coming here and for some reason that was not hinted at during her testimony is trying to put one over on you despite her lifelong affiliation with this town, her personal acquaintance with Officer Murphy and his fiancée, and her desire to see justice served. Ladies and gentlemen, there simply is no verdict supported by the evidence other than a verdict that Bonnie Parker is not guilty. Thank you for your attention, ladies and gentlemen of the jury.
Lemon peels, please. Lemon peel. The defense tells a convincing story, but he leaves some facts out. Trials are not done by convincing stories. Trials are done by facts. And you, the jurors, should retire to the jury room and make sure that you count all the facts. We don't know why Ms. Geigel didn't see a third person outside of the car. But what we do know is that there's only one person that sucks on lemons. And that's the person that sucks on lemons. She told you she was outside the car. Clyde Barrow told you she was outside the car. William Schaefer told you she was outside the car. And Henry Methvin told you she was outside the car. There's only one person that didn't tell you she was outside the car. That was Ms. Geigel. You can discount Ms. Geigel. You can discount Ms. Geigel because she can't explain why there are sucked-on lemons sitting outside the car. Once you don't believe Ms. Geigel, you have to figure out whether it was Henry or it was that woman that has fired at police officers before that killed H.D. Murphy. Henry's not a great individual. He's a career criminal. You've got to make a credibility determination to figure out which of the two are telling you the truth. But you do know a couple of things. You know she fires at police officers. You know that in this particular case, a third-party witness that has no reason to lie has told you what he saw. A woman emerge from the car, take a .45 caliber pistol, aim it at H.D. Murphy's head, and pull the trigger, giggling maniacally. That's what you've heard. There's no reason for him to tell you lies. You know to believe his story because there were lemons sitting outside the car. You have to consult the facts to make sure that you get the right person. And in this case, the facts tell you that that woman killed that man. Go back to the jury room and return that verdict for first-degree murder. She deserves it.
Ladies and gentlemen, I read to you the instruction number 1 on burden of proof immediately before the attorneys argued their case to you. I'll be handing that instruction to you along with instruction number 2, which is the instruction you need to read to determine guilt or innocence of the charge of first-degree murder, and instruction number 3, which is the instruction for you to consider if you do not believe that the defendant is guilty of first-degree murder, to consider whether she is guilty of second-degree murder, and the jury verdict form for you to find either guilty or not guilty on the charges. The jury will retire to the custody of the sheriff. You have to hand the instructions, wherever they are. And select your foreperson to deliberate and arrive at your verdict within 15 minutes or less. The court will stand in recess.